Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to have you on. Really looking forward to diving into your experience, your entrepreneurial experience, and what you've kind of learned throughout the process. Give me a little 30 to 60-second intro to what you're doing at Metis Labs.
So the weird thing about factory processes is they don't work as well as everybody thinks they do. Everybody thinks you're making an airplane, you're making a detergent or something, it just works and you press the button and it happens. But the weird truth is it doesn't. When I started working in manufacturing, I've spent about 10 years in manufacturing, and that was one of the biggest wake-ups to me. I'm in the factory and a whole batch of product gets scrapped, and that's normal. And somehow you have to ship the product out the door, make money, and in the meantime you're scrapping vast amounts of product. So for me that was like, I cannot believe this is the reality, and I wanted to solve that. So that's what we're doing with Metis Labs. All of the information around optimizing the process is somewhere within the data sets. It's just not understood. There are so many variables and so many non-linearities in the system. So we take sensor data and we use a AI-based algorithm to learn the relationships between the sensor data and the output of the process. So effectively, you can do away with the stuff I learned at university as a mechanical engineer, like physical systems and what is the length of the pipe and what is the loss factor. We don't need that. We just learn that from the data. So we're using that to be able to predict outcome of processes, understand the variables that are having the biggest impact, and in real time optimize and improve the outcome. So the result is saving tons of product and loads of energy.
So like to expand on that, what does the world look like if, the vision and the thesis of Metis Labs plays out and you make the kind of impact that you hope to make?
Most people don't know what a factory looks like inside. And so I'm going to use a really coarse analogy, which is imagine self-driving car, but a self-driving factory. Now, obviously there's a lot of nuances behind that, but I think broadly speaking, that's the kind of visual you'd have in your head.
Can you expand on that a little bit? So like, what are the main things that are going on inside a factory that that are not going to exist, or that you're going to automate away, or that you're going to massively reduce the need for sort of human intervention, or just make them more efficient in general?
Yeah. I guess before answering that question, I would say like factories in the industrial sector is a huge area, and no one company is going to kind of automate the whole factory. I think the winners in this space are going to be those companies that really focus on niches and on slices of the pie, because it's such a huge industry. You can focus on a slice and it's still a very big business. So the part of the pie that we're focusing on is really the processes. So imagine a process that's actually already quite automated, but it's automated using quite traditional methods. So rules-based control, basic engineering kind of parameters. And we're building an intelligence layer on top of that. But the wider question, what does a factory look like? It's all about the digital thread for me. Most factories have a lot of humans involved in the process still. Even if they're automated, there tend to be islands of automation that are connected by humans moving things around. So when you think of the process of making a car or making an aeroplane, robotics obviously plays a really important role, not just in moving stuff, but in measuring stuff. So this is actually not an area that we're focused on in particular, but I think a very interesting spin-off of the robotics thing is that not only can you automate the actions, but every action can be measured. So the torque, the pressure that's applied, and so you get more of a digital thread throughout the process. Because of the state of the industry, we're focused on those parts of manufacturing which already have a good digital thread. So basically those parts that are already well automated. And we know in the meantime, there's an underlying trend which has the name Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution. Love it or hate it, that's an expression that's used. But that trend in the meantime is bringing more automation, more connectedness. And so if we focus on the early adopters, we know that the rest of the industry is coming that way as well.
So cycling back to when you were thinking about starting the company, you mentioned you had sort of 10 years of experience in manufacturing. What made you actually kind of take the plunge and say, actually, I'm going to build a business that's going to do this, or I want to build a business in this space, and then forming the idea as you went along? What were the push and the pull factors that were driving you towards that path?
I think I always intended to make my own path. I always intended to probably run my own business and not follow the herd. And it was kind of a surprise to me when I woke up a number of years in and I'm working in a factory following quite a well-trodden kind of career path. And I thought, like, I literally just woke up one day and I thought, this is not what I had planned for myself. And if I don't change something, I know exactly where I'll be in 5 years' time. And it's a good career and it's a good paycheck, but it's not what I'm looking for. So there was kind of a catalyst moment. But I studied mechanical engineering, and I was always really interested in not just the design component, but how do you take a design and you actually make stuff. So somewhere along the line, there's an invisible process. People know about designing stuff. People know about buying stuff from a shop, but what happens in between? And like, this is kind of weird, but I would always be drawn to the imagery of like Father Christmas shipping out the products on Christmas Eve, and like, how does that process actually work? And the economics around that, and all of the humans and people. And actually, something that's not really well recognized is that manufacturing, the industrial sector, actually does employ a vast number of people around the world. And so it's actually really important to the way our society operates, having kind of gainful employment for people, and factories form a large component of that. So when I woke up and I found that I was still working in this manufacturing environment, my first thought was, I need to move on. But I wanted to try to change it before I moved on. I wanted to try and contribute and not quit from it, but somehow like make a change. So I ended up setting up an accelerator in the large manufacturing firm I worked for, with a view that like, hey, we've got so many smart people, 50,000 people around the world, like they have great ideas. Let's try to give them a platform. So it was very much a sort of internal accelerator. But then eventually one day I also realized, like, that's great, but that's not changing the world. That's trying to change a company, but the world's so much bigger than that. And so that's why I stepped away and came to EF to take on a bigger challenge.
How did you first hear about EF?
My friend Phoebe was on EF. She was on EF 5. And when she first told me, I'm going off to do this program called Entrepreneur First, I had no idea what it was. I thought it sounded like a graduate scheme, Entrepreneur First. But I followed her progress, and I was one of kind of her alpha testers for her product. And as I saw her progress and her product progress, I realized how serious a program it was and how professional it was. And watching her build an extremely impressive product and really, doing something that's important to the world, I kind of realized, actually, this is something that could fit in my life as well. She kept saying, hey, Alex, this is right up your street. You should go along. And eventually I realized that she was right.
So when you did finally get on the program, how did you go about the process of finding a co-founder? Did you test a lot of different people? Or was it kind of like love at first sight? You and Bashir started working together as soon as you sort of basically jumped on the program?
No, there was a whole process around it. I entered the program fairly open-minded, without being too strategic. I just thought, you know what, I'm going to learn a lot. It'll work out. I'll find the right person and we'll go from there. And I ended up working with a few different people, and they were all great. They were all great to work with. But part of the quite amazing learning from EF is you have this opportunity to experiment working with different people, and you start to find out what works and what doesn't work. And it doesn't just work to co-found a business with someone you really get on with or you share a vision with. These things are important, but you also need to have a certain asymmetric skill set where you can actually, they're good at what you're not good at. And I know, to start with, for me, I was drawn towards, I worked with someone who was absolutely fantastic, but actually we were probably almost carbon copies of each other. And EF kind of helped us realize that probably we weren't going to be able to build the product we were setting out to build together. So I ended up meeting Bashir. I think Bashir was one of the quieter people on the program. And so I didn't immediately kind of get to know him. And it was only after a bit of time, I was sat next to him in the pub, and he started talking to me about what he'd done with his previous company. He'd built a deep learning company, and they were doing medical vision analysis. And I was really impressed with what he'd done technically, but also his mindset. So he'd moved from Malaysia to New Zealand to go study a master's and go work. And then he moved from New Zealand to London just to start a business on EF. And he struck me as someone who was very driven, very motivated, but also very, not a self-publicist, but, really just a true, what he said is, it's one of those people, when he says something, you listen because he's thought about it.
And so how did the two of you sort of go about the process of putting together what you're obviously now working on? What was the ideation process like? Did it go through a number of iterations in the early stages, or did you sort of pretty early settle on in terms of, you're going to be focusing on this space and this is more or less the type of thing that you're going to be building to solve the problems in it?
What we started working on exceeded my expectations of what was possible. So this is the weird thing about EF. I started EF with a lens in front of my eyes of what I thought was possible based on the experiences I'd had in the past. And coming from a kind of traditional manufacturing and mechanical engineering background, the limits of my capabilities were kind of the traditional approaches that we'd used and studied. And working with Bashir, he kind of opened my eyes to what he could do using the technology that he'd used in the past, and it was completely new to me. And for me, there was one moment that sticks in my mind where he showed me like an MVP of something he'd produced based on a problem that we were looking at. And he'd had this algorithm just learn how to do something. And there was no physics modeling behind, and I was quite blown away. And I just remember thinking, no way, I didn't know that was possible. And so that was how we came to work on what we're working on. It was only through working with Bashir that I realized that the problem that I was trying to solve actually was solvable. When I came into EF, I had a couple of ideas I wanted to work on, and this one was one that I thought was great, but I thought was too hard to solve.
So how did you then go about the process? We were speaking before the conversation started, before the camera started rolling, a little bit about product market fit, and how like most startups are still sort of trying to find that product market fit for quite a long time. What was the kind of feedback loop for you in terms of going back into the manufacturing sector, presumably, and speaking to people or trying to find your first customers or people who might be interested? What kind of things were you doing at early stages around that?
So I think there's different levels of product market fit. I mean, maybe not. Maybe actually ultimately when you get to product market fit, you pour some money on your business and you end up selling them. I think the early stages of finding the product market fit for us were really around exploring the market. So a lot of customer development conversations. Then when we felt like we'd found the right niche to focus on, then it was more about going deeper with those particular customers. So getting into the situation of running pilots with them, exchanging data. In order to test our hypothesis and in order to sort of develop what we were doing, we needed to work quite closely with customers. I think that's probably the hardest part for us. That has been a hard part because the industrial sectors move quite slowly. And it's a well understood problem. They move slowly. So one of our challenges is find ways to accelerate that. And so we're building in this thinking into our product, which is actually, it's quite fun, challenging the status quo. But yeah, no, we're at the stage now where we're really working on going deep with a couple of customers, really spending time on, we've worked a lot on the core technology. We're now really working on the product side of things. So finding those features that are really killer features that people love. And very often those killer features actually, they're not even the deepest tech. They're just something that resonates with the user. So I think that's quite a fun challenge.
For sure. You're at quite an interesting crossroads right now because obviously, as we were talking about before, in the process of like tying up a funding round and you're looking to make your first hires. So what things are you looking for in the people that you're looking to bring on board? Are there certain questions that you're going to be asking them? Are there certain qualities that you're going to be filtering for? What's kind of going through your mind at this stage in terms of getting those first people on board?
Yeah. As the months have gone by, Bashir and I have talked a lot about company culture, and we think culture is just super important. It's not everything, but it kind of is. So there's a few things that we have in mind. Actually, there was a talk at EF from the CEO of Taboola, and we took away quite a lot from that. It was great. But we have written on the wall next to us, what does it say? Smart, passionate, and kind, or with integrity. And for us, those are kind of the three things that no matter how smart, no matter how kind of talented someone is, they've got to be, smart. They've got to be passionate about the problem. We're setting out there trying to make the world more sustainable, by doing something quite unglamorous. We're going into factories and helping them become more efficient. But it's a really important problem. So we need them to resonate with that. And we also need people to have integrity. So to have a kind mindset and have an honest mindset. Ultimately, the relationships with customers, employees, investors, everything relies upon having great integrity. And also with each other. Hey, I'm having difficulty with this problem. Like, we need to talk about it. I think that's really important to us. So those are some of the things we think about in terms of culture. In terms of some of the more practicalities about recruiting, I'll have to tell you in a few months' time.
Well, we'll definitely have to have another chat about it then. Before we move on, just tell me a little bit about the fundraising process. So what have you learned from this kind of, I can imagine pretty challenging and lengthy experience of getting people to buy into your vision and what you're doing? What are a few things that you've picked up on that you'll keep in mind for next time?
There's a lot I've learned about fundraising, almost too much to even kind of extract from my mind. But one of the things that has proved to be more important and has become clear to me is so important is relationships and trust. It is quite a relationship-driven engagement, because you're working out whether you want to go into business with someone, and vice versa. And so, again, coming back to that point of integrity, you might have a conversation with somebody now. You might have a conversation with 50 people now who decide it's not the right time to invest. But that conversation is the beginning of your relationship, and you'll continue to communicate with each other, give them updates. And actually, they might choose to invest at a later round, or even in a later company, that you might have sometime in the future. So, yeah, it was a surprise to me that those relationships are really important, but actually when you look at it objectively, of course they are.
If we cycle back just for a second to, you mentioned sort of that turning point that you had when you decided to sort of, basically throw yourself off a cliff and go and build that company in the space. Do you think there was anything that was stopping you from doing that before it, other than just sort of, you mentioned you sort of felt like you woke up one day and you just, were like, I can see where this is going, but, it's not really what I had planned for myself. Do you think there was anything stopping you other than just sort of a lack of awareness of how that path was progressing? Or were there any thoughts or hesitations that you had that sort of made you think, I'm not sure whether I want to do this?
If you've had if you have a steady job and a steady income, there is always the question of like, where the hell's the money going to come from? Yeah. So there's that. I think for me, there's also a fear of failure. And I think this is something that, coming as so many of us do, we go through education and there's always hoops to jump through. Yeah. And we're used to succeeding going through those hoops. Well, when you go out and you start a business, what statistically a large percentage of startups fail. And so you're entering into this new realm where it's less about worrying about success and failure, and it's more about getting to the point where if there is going to be a failure or a pivot required or something, getting to that point as quickly as possible, learning from it and continuing. And what in other worlds might look like a failure actually is not. It's just a point where you reassess and you realign and you carry on. So I think there's a shift in mindset around thinking, I'm always going to get A stars, I'm always going to get the gold mark, to being like, the world is going to be full of mistakes and that's part of the journey and we'll get there regardless. And I think the structure of EF was really important for me as well. So knowing that you go into this program where even if you don't end up building a business through it, you guaranteed in the 3 months, whatever time you're involved, you're going to learn so much. You're going to come away with a whole new insight on the world and what's possible. And as I mentioned around technologies, I had no idea what we are doing now was even possible. So, in another life, if I wasn't building this business, I'd come away at least with that knowledge. Sort of
like working along those lines of the learning experience. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about what you learned through building the company, about all of these various areas from fundraising to product market fit, etc. You touched on the sort of the mindset element of becoming more comfortable with failure. Are there any other things that you've learned about yourself on a more personal level through the process of building Metis Labs?
I think something I've learned about myself is how I deal with uncertainty and how I deal with stressful situations. The only person managing my time and energy is myself. And so how do I create barriers in my life that give me the ability to keep working day after day and not burn out? I think that's quite important. When I have the answer, I'll tell you.
And how?
But I feel like I'm getting there.
For sure. And just out of interest, how have you gone about doing that? So, for instance, we have cut-off times where you'll say, "I'm not going to work beyond these hours." I imagine, obviously, sometimes you have to break those rules. What are some of those boundaries that you've tried to put in place to make sure that what you're doing is sustainable?
Personal relationships. So making the time to hang out with friends, spend more time with my girlfriend. Sports. So for me, doing sport is a source of energy. The more I go train, work, I like to do CrossFit. And during the course of last year, while I was starting through EF, I dropped all of that. And it was only towards the end of last year, I suddenly realized, like, I don't do sport anymore. And it's getting me down. And so recognizing that it's not an optional luxury, as it sometimes feels like it is, but actually it's something that's really important. And if I spend an hour doing sport, I'm going to have more energy for everything else. So things like that, things that sometimes seem like I can just put that on hold for a few months. Well, like, few months becomes a few years. So just bringing into place those, enjoying the things that you enjoy and that give you energy. I think that's something that's been a learning for me.
For sure. And just to finish up, for any potential founders listening or aspiring founders listening who are possibly on the fence about, jumping off a cliff as you did, would you give any advice, or would you offer any questions that they might ask themselves to make that process easier?
I think the best thing you can do is identify what specifically is holding you back. Are there specific things? Is it that you're going to run out of money, or that you're going to get off this career ladder and then never be able to get back on if you want to? Or what is it? And then just work out what the worst case scenario is and check out what your mitigation measures are. Like, if it's money, how much money do you need in the bank? If it's career ladder, talk to someone who's been through this process before and actually gone back and got back on the career ladder. Or talk to someone from EF, because they see so many people coming through. And mostly those things that seem huge barriers to you, when you actually break them down like that, they're not. And all of those things I've mentioned, money, career ladder, I can guarantee, like, you're going to be in a better position after going through a program like EF, whatever the outcome.
That is an awesome note to end on. Alex, thanks a lot for coming on the show. It was a pleasure chatting.
You're welcome. Pleasure to chat.